How's that? Better? Better.
Make sure. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, we're good. Hello. How's everybody doing today? Yeah, please make sure to turn off your phones. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, welcome to part of our Wednesdays at the J literary series. We have a very special guest here today, Joshua Henkin, who's written a wonderful book, Morningside Heights. Okay, and on behalf of the Jewish Book Council and the Miami Beach JCC, I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming today and braving the weather, and everyone who is watching online. We're going to have a very interesting discussion with Joshua. My name is Danny Reed. I am the Director of Cultural Arts and Adult Programming, and I want to welcome you all here today. So Joshua, this is, I'm sure there is a lot more to you, okay, but this is your Jewish Book Council bio. Sure. May I?
Absolutely.
Okay. So Joshua Henkin is the author of Swimming Across the Hudson, Matrimony, and the World Without You, winner of the Edward Lewis Wallant Award for Jewish American Fiction, and finalist for the National Book Award. He was raised as an Orthodox Jew on Manhattan's Upper West Side, and now lives in Brooklyn with his wife, 2 daughters, and their gigantic Newfoundland puppy, who I'm assuming is full-grown right now.
He's full-grown. He's almost 5 years old. He's big.
And I understand also that you're the director of the Masters in Fine Arts program at Brooklyn College.
Yeah, I direct the fiction writing program.
The fiction writing program. All right, wonderful. So welcome.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you all for coming.
So I'm glad you're here. I'm really glad you're here and that you made it. And listen, let's start off with the basic question. Can you tell us a little bit about Morningside Heights and what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. So it's a Morningside chronicles several decades of a marriage, and it's about Pru Steiner, who grew up in suburban Columbus, Ohio, in an Orthodox Jewish family, and she goes off to Yale and then moves to New York and starts graduate school at Columbia, and she meets and falls in love with her Shakespeare professor, and she ends up giving up her academic aspirations and becoming, a famous professor's wife. They have a daughter together. Spence has a son from a previous marriage. And then when Spence is in his late 50s, he starts to become forgetful, and he is eventually diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And so Pru and Sarah and the son Arlo and various other people have to figure out, make some hard choices and sort of figure out how to help him as he's in decline. So, it is a book about dementia, but it's really, people say to me, do I really want to read a book about dementia? But that's not really what the book's about. The book's really about a long marriage and a family. And, in any long marriage and any family over, many years, there are good times and there are harder times. And the book chronicles those things. So, yeah, in terms of the inspiration for the novel, like Spence, my father was a well-known professor at Columbia. He taught at Columbia Law School for close to 50 years. And fortunately, if you can ever use the word fortunately when it comes to dementia, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's much later than Spence was. So Spence was in his late 50s. My father was in his mid to late 80s. Let's say around 87. But he was still teaching at Columbia at the time, which is a story in its own right and, says something both about my father and about academia, especially you have a well-known professor involved and what gets tolerated. But in any case, the book in many ways was really inspired by my mother, who is 15 years younger than my father. My father died in 2010. My mother is still alive. And when my father was in decline, my mother decided to go to a caregiver's class at the JCC on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I was interested in that because she's not a caregiver's class sort of person. She's not a consorting with strangers sort of person. And I was interested in what had happened for her and to her that she decided she would take comfort in the company of people whom she might not have had that much in common with, aside from the fact that they were all caregivers. And so the novel really started out actually as a long short story that took place at the JCC between Pru and the people she meets at the JCC. And for those of you who've read the book, you'll know that there is no JCC in the novel, and that's because the book ended up being totally different from what I thought it would be. You know, I say no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. I worked on the novel for 8 years, and I wrote 3,000 pages and threw out 2,700 of them, so 90% of them are gone. And among those 90% are all the material that was at the JCC. Everyone from the JCC is gone except for the character Walter, who does feature prominently later in the book, and I managed a way to get him into the book without the help of the JCC. So that's where the germ of the idea started. But you know, a book never goes where you think it's going to go.
So can we go back to that? I mean, I have a couple questions about Pru, but can we go back to that what you just said? Because I think from the reactions, from my reaction and the reaction that I saw with everybody else, can we go back to your writing process? Because you said you wrote about 3,000 pages.
I did.
And you cut out 90%. Now, is this something that you felt you had to do just for this novel, or has that been your process all along with your other work?
Well, I mean, anytime you write 3,000 pages, you got to cut out at least 70 or 80% of them because, you know, you're not going to get a reader to read a 3,000-page book.
Why did you feel you had to write that much?
That's generally how I write, although I'm working on 2 new novels now where I'm trying to do it a little differently. But for me, fiction is very deeply about character, about getting to explore your characters and figuring out who they are. And if you think you know them too soon, you get what a colleague of mine calls overparented characters, where, you know, you decide who they are before you've let them breathe. And so for me, a lot of the process of writing is just, you know, writing everything, not censoring it all, you know, vomiting it out essentially, seeing the mess you produce. And then at that point you go back and you put your thinking cap on and you say, well, you know, this, I need to keep this, I need to cut that. But I mean, I feel like it'd be very hard for me to write only a few hundred pages and then have that be the book. I really need to write a lot more pages and cut down. Although in the books I'm working on now, I'm trying to make it a slightly shorter process. But you know, I feel like a book takes as long as it takes.
So how many drafts do you do then? Like, what is that? Because I know
it's hard. It depends what constitutes a draft. I mean, I probably have, you know, a couple of dozen like real drafts where there are big changes, and then, you know, hundreds and hundreds of revisions on the line level. You know, changing a word here, changing a word there. I mean, yeah, it's not a business for the faint-hearted or for the non-compulsive, I would say. So, you know, it's interesting that you said you felt that the way that you write, you have to let the characters come out of you, like speak for yourself. So I'm curious about Pru in that why, well, there's a few things. Why did you decide to make her from the Midwest? Like, why was that important for you? And why you made her grow up in an extremely, you wrote her as somebody who grew up in a very Jewish home, extremely Jewish home, but when she reaches adulthood and meets Spence, that's something that does not seem important to her anymore. And so you're asking why she leaves?
Well, I'm curious as to why did you set her as growing up in the Midwest, and then, you know, as she grows into adulthood, you know, why did you write her as somebody who meets this person who she gives up, you know, that type of life for?
So yeah, they're good questions. They're hard to answer. I mean, you know, the simplest but slightly glib answer is that's just who she is. But I mean, you know, if I made her from Boston, you could ask why she didn't come from the Midwest, or I made her from California. I'm not trying to be obtuse. I guess I'm saying is that, you know, Flannery O'Connor once said that a fiction writer can't do without a certain measure of stupidity. And I think it's true. You know, some of us come by it naturally, others have to cultivate it. So I think, you know, we do things intuitively, and then we can try to speculate as to why we do things. But, you know, it's not like I said I need her to be from the Midwest. That's where she came from. I guess I could sort of reverse outline and say that, I see her as someone who, has the idea of moving to the big city, and, the opening, Garcia Marquez once said that once he has the first paragraph of a piece of fiction, everything else follows, which is why he finds a novel 12 times easier than a collection of stories, because he needs 12 first paragraphs for a collection of stories, only one for a novel. But I think there's a kind of, it's being facetious, but I think there's a certain truth to that. And I do think that the opening, the opening sentence of the book has the entire book incubating in it. And if I remember correctly, the opening of sentence of the book is, growing up in Bexley in the suburbs of Columbus, Pru was drawn to the older boys, thinking they could take her far from home. And I think the idea of her moving to the big city and falling in love with this powerful man and what that does for her and to her is very deeply what the book's about. I mean, could I have her grow up in Miami or in Boston or even in New York? Yeah, but it just felt instinctively like she should be from somewhere that was a little smaller with a kind of aspiration to be in a big city. In terms of her leaving the faith, she continues to identify strongly as Jewish. She's just not Orthodox in the way she was when she grew up. Why does that happen? It happens to a lot of people, although not to everyone. Spence himself is an atheist, a red diaper baby. I think she's deeply influenced by him in general, and I think he's not up for keeping a religious home, and so she sort of relents in some ways. But I was interested in, again, I'm speculating, working backwards, because I really do proceed intuitively. But I think that I was interested in exploring, when Spence gets sick, she goes to shul, she goes to synagogue, she says a Misha Berach, she says a blessing for the sick. And she goes to say Kaddish for her father. So she periodically in the book returns to synagogue. And I think she's hoping for a kind of solace in that. But I think she doesn't really quite get that solace. And I think in retrospect, I was interested in writing I have a lot of friends and acquaintances and colleagues, etc., who are, relatively secular people, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, who, some of whom grew up in more traditionally religious homes, some of whom did not. But among the ones who did grow up in more traditional religious homes, they can sometimes look back with a certain nostalgia for their earlier faith. And it's not like they could ever go back to being that way, but they feel some longing for that life. And then I have some friends who were never religious growing up, but who imagine what it would be like. And so I feel like in some ways the book is, chronicling the experience of nostalgia for, it's doing a lot of things, but it's chronicling nostalgia for faith. Toward the end of I'm getting into the weeds here, but toward the end of the book, on Pru's mother's 85th birthday, I believe, Pru and Spence is very far gone at this point. Pru and Sarah go out with Spence to Ohio for her 85th birthday, and Pru and Sarah go to Pru's father's grave, Sarah's grandfather's grave, and Sarah says to Pru, I wish you'd sent me to Jewish day school. Sarah was sent to Hebrew school, she had a bat mitzvah, but she says, I wish you'd sent me to Jewish day school, at least you were able to make a choice. And what she's saying to her mother is, you went to Jewish day school, you made a choice to leave. I wasn't really given a choice because I wasn't given the Jewish education you had. And, I'm sympathetic to and understand that perspective, but I went to Jewish day school myself, and I could show you, more than half my classmates who would tell you that they really resent their parents for shoving it down their throats. So, there's no winning. You always want what you don't have. But I do think that the story is very deeply about people who are culturally strongly identified as Jews, some of whom have a certain yearning for an earlier faith that they no longer, maintain.
That they don't have anymore. No, thank you for that. That's a great answer. So I have another, I don't know if this is a strange question or not, but because, a writer writes, but was this difficult for you to write as one of the main characters, or from mainly the wife's point of view, as a man writing a woman?
Yeah, everything's hard. That's why it takes 8 years. But don't feel. I mean, each character poses different challenges, and some of them are easier than others, although they're all hard in some way. But even if you're writing narrowly autobiographically, which I wasn't, but even if you were, at most there's one character who's you. So all the other characters have to not be you, and so you're always imagining someone who's different from you. And you might be a poor person imagining a rich person, or a gregarious person imagining a shy person, or a Democrat imagining a Republican, or a city dweller imagining a rural person. Or so you're always moving away from yourself in some sort of way. And I don't see gender as being any different from any other thing. So it's not that Pru is an easy character to write, but she's no easier or harder than a male character. I mean, each character poses different challenges, but fiction is deeply about the imagination. I mean, I think there's certain qualities that are required of a fiction writer for sure, and obviously if you have to have some sense of language, you have to have an eye and an ear. I mean, I teach graduate students, and I know that if you have a tin ear, it's very hard to teach someone to be a good fiction writer. But I think even more than that, or at least as important as that, is you have to be curious. You kind of have to be a gossip. I mean, my mother likes to tell the story that when I was a toddler, I insisted on being picked up, and I had to look into every storefront on Broadway in Morningside Heights, where I grew up. I mean, I think that's what a fiction writer is someone who needs to be picked up and wants to look into every storefront. So I feel like fiction writing is deeply about the imagination, and for me, imagining a female character, imagining a male character, it's kind of all the same. In other words, you always have to deeply inhabit your characters and get at all their particularities.
I know you said it took you 8 years to write this, but did you find that in that process of even writing the 3,000 pages, because the novel is set primarily in an area that you're extremely familiar with, did that make it easier for you, or was it even more difficult because you felt compelled to describe it or create it in much the way that you experienced it growing up? Yeah,
no, it's a good question. I mean, I would never say that anything is easy. I mean, for sure, but it's interesting. I mean, I do think that different writers have different strengths and weaknesses, and you sort of try to play to your strengths and overcome your weaknesses. I'm definitely able to write about characters, people I've never met, and imagine them saying things I've never heard said. So that's not, I mean, that takes work, but I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I have trouble writing about places that I've never been to or don't know relatively well. So I tend to write about places I know well, or about fiction. I sometimes will write about a fictionalized town where I'm not beholden to any actual landmarks. But I've been to Miami a bunch of times, but I feel like it would take some doing for me to write a book that's set in Miami, because I don't know it super well. I mean, if someone wanted to fly me down here for more than a couple of days so that I could stay at the Betsy Hotel and research a novel in Miami, that I could certainly do that. It's interesting. My last novel, the one before this one, The World Without You, at some point, that novel takes place really over a 3-day period in Lenox, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires. And I've spent some time in the Berkshires, but I hadn't spent that much time there at that point, and more in Great Barrington than in Lenox. And at some point, pretty late in the writing process, my editor said to me, gently but firmly, she said, "Josh, how well do you know Lenox anyway?" And that was a sign that I had to go up to Lenox and, get to know it better. But I do think it's complicated, because, you want things to be accurate, and you will always have readers emailing you, telling you what you got wrong. That always happens. Sometimes they're wrong when they tell me what I got wrong, but occasionally they're right. But you want to be accurate, but you don't want the book to feel like it was written by Google Maps. And I've seen books that feel like they were written by Google Maps, and I've seen books that are over-researched. And maybe I'm just justifying my own laziness as a researcher, because I am a quite lazy researcher. But I kind of feel like you got to wear your research lightly. And so, you want to have an accurate sense of place, but you don't want to be spending time feeling like you are writing, like I'm writing a novel. I'm not writing a tour book. And so, for me, in that sense, Morningside Heights was the ideal neighborhood to write about because I grew up in Morningside Heights in the shadow of Columbia. I lived there for the first 18 years of my life. My mother still lives in the apartment I grew up in on Riverside Drive. My brother lives 5 blocks away. My wife is the chair of the religion department at Barnard, so she's up in Morningside Heights all the time. So it's a neighborhood I know well, and because I know it well, I don't have to expend a lot of effort in trying to show that I know it well. I'm able to wear it lightly, whereas I think a neighborhood I knew less well, where I had to do research, I might be overcompensating and trying too hard to be Google Maps. So in that sense, Morningside Heights was a good place for me to write about.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Can we talk about Arlo?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, do you want to be more? I mean, you don't need to be more specific. I'm happy to take it from there. Well, so yeah. So again, I don't know for people who haven't read I don't want to give any spoilers. Though this is really not a spoiler kind of book at all. It's a very character-driven book. I mean, there are things that happen, but it's not a spoiler book, so don't have to worry too much about that. But Arlo is Spence's son from a previous marriage, who's raised largely, almost exclusively by his mother, Linda, who's a certain kind of hippie. Linda wants to poop in all 50 states. That's her goal. And so she takes Arlo with her wherever she goes. Arlo is very smart, but he's dyslexic, and he's not a good student by traditional standards. And Spence is a very good student by traditional standards. And, it's interesting. There are certain characters who I knew were going to be in the book from the start. For instance, Ginny, who is Spence's caregiver when he's in decline. And I just think that relationship is so interesting. And, Ginny's invented, but she's inspired in certain ways by some of my father's caregivers when he was in decline. So I knew she would be there. But Arlo actually came along, later in the process. At some point I said to myself, well, what if Spence had a son from a previous marriage? And I thought, nah. But I'm a big believer in not censoring myself too early, and that's how you end up with 3,000 pages. But I decided to try it, and once I tried it, Arlo really opened up the book for me in very interesting ways. And again, I'll have to speculate as to why my instinct was to write Arlo. But I'm always telling my graduate students that you shouldn't write a story about a ball rolling down the hill, because if you write a story about a ball rolling down the hill, the ball will in fact roll down the hill. And that is one of the challenges of writing about Alzheimer's, because in terms of the actual medicine of it, unfortunately, you know what the end is going to be. Obviously the particulars are different from person to person, but unfortunately the diagnosis is the diagnosis. And so there's really not a lot of tension in what's going to happen to Spence. The tension is really surrounds the other characters, the ones who don't have Alzheimer's, and what they are going to do in the face of this difficult situation. And so, I really wasn't interested in writing the book from Spence's point of view. We are in Spence's point of view when he's younger, when he's lucid, but once he's no longer lucid, I wasn't interested in writing about what it's like to have Alzheimer's. People have done that, and I'm not knocking it, and it can be done well. It did not interest me. So there are various ways in which I was trying to avoid the ball rolling down the hill problem. And I think the creation of Arlo was another way to avoid the ball rolling down the hill problem, though in a different way. And I think my instinct was that, someone like Sarah, Pru and Spence's kid, she's an interesting character to me, for sure. But she is, roughly speaking, the kind of person that you would think would be Pru and Spence's daughter. She's a good student, with a couple of notable exceptions. She's relatively well behaved. She doesn't cause them a lot of grief. She goes off to medical school. Whereas Arlo causes himself and them, and specifically Spence, a lot of grief. And I felt like I needed a live wire to open up the book in a certain way. And I kind of feel like fiction writing is about getting to know your characters, and the way you get to know your characters is by getting them into trouble. And Arlo is trouble. And so in that sense, I was really drawn to him. And once I started to write him, the book opened up in very interesting ways for me.
But can you expand on that? Why did it open up for you? Like what did Arlo do that and how he interacted with the rest of the family.
Well, I think any mixed family is a complicated one, because he's really been he spends a couple of years when he's a teenager living with Pru and Spence and Sarah. They're kind of a disastrous couple of years, but prior to that, he's there only occasionally on vacations, and so Sarah lives as an only child, essentially, and then along comes this older brother to live with her, and that's a real challenge for her. And of course, it's a challenge for any step-parent, in this case, Pru, to, be a kind of mother to a son who is not her own son, who's not biologically related to her, whom she hasn't spent a lot of time with. It's a challenge for her. And then it's a challenge for Spence, because Arlo's a challenging guy, and I think Spence is a challenging guy. I mean, I feel like they're both stubborn. Spence just feels like if only Arlo would study harder for the SAT, all would be well in the world. And that's not true. And, Spence has a pretty narrow idea of what success is, what accomplishment is, what's worthwhile. Arlo goes on to make a lot of money in tech. He's intent on doing things differently from his father. By the time Arlo makes a lot of money in tech, his father can't really understand any longer what he's doing. But but Spence looks down on money. He really is contemptuous of it. And so, I guess in all those ways, I think you need to put your characters in conflict with each other to explore them. And so, Arlo is, the kindling that, brings about the fire of conflict, with Sarah, with Pru, with Spence. And I think that's how you inform character, is by putting people in difficult situations. If you're just writing about characters for whom everything is easy, you don't get to know them. That's what Tolstoy meant when he said all happy families are alike and every unhappy family is different. I think you can write about happy characters, but you can't write about characters. You can write about characters who are dispositionally happy, who have a tendency toward happiness, but it's really hard to write a novel that's just about being happy. That's just not what novels are about. Novels are about characters who are challenged in some ways and, dealing with those challenges.
Well, you're right. There has to be some type of conflict, right? Mm-hmm. But there has to be resolution also. Right. So I don't want to give away spoilers for those who haven't read it, but I'm not sure what the resolution is here. I mean, you have.
Well, it depends how you look at resolution. I mean, so.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. Well, I mean, I don't really think there's very many spoilers in this book, but I can speak vaguely about this, but more generally. You want to feel at the end of the novel that the story has reached some kind of conclusion. You don't, on the other hand, want to tie things up neatly in a bow because that feels contrived. I'm always telling my grad students, the easiest way to end your story is you just kill everyone, and then there can't be any more story. So
isn't that what true. Stephen King does? I mean,
yeah. So that's true. That is the easiest way. Whether that's the most enriching way aesthetically, I think is pretty doubtful. So you want to feel like the book has come to an end in the sense that the story has reached a certain kind of conclusion, but there's still more to come for the characters, and you don't know what's going to happen afterwards, and that you leave room for a sequel. Not that 8 years is more than enough time on these characters, and I moved on to new ones, but I think you don't want to make things such that there aren't possibilities for them, once it's over. So, I mean, I know I'm speaking vaguely because I don't want to say too much about what happens at the end of the book, but I guess I kind of feel like the book does that. It reaches a kind of conclusion, but there's more to come and if one of you wants to write the sequel, knock yourselves out. So.
Is there a passage that you would like to read us that particularly speaks to you that you would like to
share?
Sure,
I'm happy to. I mean, how long? You want me to read for 2 minutes, 5 minutes? Like what?
It's like 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay,
that'd be great.
Then I will read.
But
I can read. I'll read.
No, because I'm always curious. Especially, I can't get over the You know, it reminds me of what Hemingway said, the iceberg method, like you only show 10%.
Right,
And
tip,
the other
tip of the iceberg
90%.
implies the whole iceberg.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I talk to my grad students about that, and I will read. Sometimes after workshop, I'll say to someone whose story has been up in workshop, I'll say, I'm not sure you know your characters well enough yet, and I'll ask them a series of questions about their characters, and if they're defensive, as they sometimes are, they'll say, well, I don't see why that has to be in the story. And the answer is it doesn't have to be in the story, but you need to know the answer to those questions, and that knowledge will percolate up. And so I think that's what Hemingway means about the tip of the iceberg, is that what's sticking out of the water is what you see, but there really has to be a whole iceberg beneath the surface, and that's all the stuff that's not in the book, but that is in some way informing the book because you know your characters really well. Whereas if you don't know your characters really well, then all you have is the tip, and there is no iceberg beneath it. And so, you're always, to me, the burden of proof is on keeping something, not on leaving it out. And I'm always saying to myself, what can I get rid of? Really trying to distill the book down to its very essence. So, any case, I'll read briefly from two separate sections of the book. And the first one is from when Pru and Spence first meet. It's on page 5 of the book.
and you have to tell us why these speak to you so much.
Why what?
Why they speak to you so much. Why are you choosing these? And
I don't know. I mean, less that they speak to me that I feel like, the Pru and Spence's relationship is the central relationship in the book. So why not see them when they first meet? And then the second section I'll read from is from Arlo's section, and that's because Arlo's an entirely different character. But, in the same way that, I could have had her from Columbus, but I could have also had her from Cleveland. I could choose a different section from the book, but these are the ones I'm choosing. So anyway, her first day of class, she looked up from her seminar table and saw Spence Robin, her Shakespeare professor, enter the room. He was only 6 years older than she was, but he was the professor, Columbia's rising star. So when she passed him on a snowy afternoon outside chock full of nuts, she glanced away. Are you pretending to be shy, Miss Steiner? That was how he addressed the class. Miss Steiner, Mr. Jones, Mr. Thompson, Miss Dunleavy, doing it with an edge of humor as if it were a mild joke. We do spend most of our day outside the classroom. It's not like we just materialize in Philosophy Hall. A gale blew past him, and Spence's jacket collar flapped up to his ears. His shock of auburn hair was covered in snow, and Pru was tempted to offer him her hat. But her hat was pink, and if she gave it to him, then she would get covered in snow, and she knew he wouldn't countenance that. They seated themselves in chock full of nuts. The coffee's terrible here, Spence said. Pru agreed, though she was inured to terrible coffee. She drank terrible coffee most days, often from chock full of nuts. Spence removed a packet of peanuts. It was an old habit, he explained, a product of his fast metabolism. He'd been so thin as a boy, he'd been sent to summer camp by the Fresh Air Fund, and when he failed to gain more than a few pounds, he got to stay for an extra 2 weeks. The snow was falling harder now. At this rate, they'd be skiing home. Pru said, Are we going to talk about Coriolanus? Do you want to talk about Coriolanus? As long as you don't make me recite. It was what Spence did in class, saying that word recite with the same little ironical smile he wore when he called her Miss Steiner. How about you tell me where you're from? Under the influence of the coffee and urged on by the wind coming through the open door, Pru started to loosen. She was from the suburbs of Columbus, she said. Sounds like a tautology to me. She surprised herself by saying, You little snob. Little? It was true, he must have been 6 feet tall. And what's in the suburbs of Columbus? Oh, just a bunch of complicated Jewish families like mine. Another tautology? So you know about complicated Jewish families? I come from one. This surprised her. With his rangy, slender frame, his pale face and thatch of red hair, he put her in mind of the Irish countryside. And Spence, she thought of Spencer Tracy, not to mention his last name Robin. Well, you could have fooled her. My Christian name is Shulam, he said. That doesn't sound very Christian to me. Okay, then I'm going to skip a bunch of pages and read from a section when Arlo, as a teenager, he's like 16, 17 at the time, comes to live with Pru and Spence and Sarah, and his father gets him a job at an independent bookstore, kind of Morningside Heights version of Books and Books in Miami. And Arlo is prone to cause trouble, and he starts to cause trouble at the bookstore, and these couple of paragraphs illustrate that trouble. He'd moved from hauling and opening boxes to shelving books, and soon books were being discovered in the wrong sections of the store. Someone said, "What's the catcher in the rye doing in sports?" That's Arlo's section. Arlo denied having shelved the catcher in the rye in sports. Over the next 2 weeks, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own was found in home furnishing. Graham Greene's The Quiet American in spirituality and meditation. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird in nature. Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in science and medicine. And William Burroughs' Naked Lunch in cookbooks. What the Farewell to Arms doing in military history, someone said. Soon there were more sightings. Jean Reese's White Sargasso Sea in marine biology. William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying in Death and Mourning. John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meaning in religion and spirituality. And George Orwell's Animal Farm in gardening. Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited wasn't with the books at all, but was shelved instead with the bridal magazines. The misshelvings were Arlo's doing, but whether they were mistakes would have been hard for him to say. Some were oversights, others came closer to acts of sabotage. Okay, so I'll stop reading there.
Thank you very much. So, it's interesting, because I'm thinking, is that just mischievous behavior, or is it rebellion against his father as well?
Yeah, it's all of the above.
It's all the above.
Everything with Arlo is all of the above. So.
That is great. That is great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So let's start thinking of questions from the audience. And Debbie, can you see if there's any questions on the chat? That would be great. If anybody has anything to say, because I know I see some knowing over there, some knowing, nods. So I'm assuming that some people have read the book. So I don't know if you have any a question for.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for the book. I went to Warner, my husband went to Columbia. We spent many years on Morningside Heights, and many times in Chocolate Nuts and all the other places
Right.
that you mentioned. And also, I was a caregiver for my husband at the end of life, and I thought your description of what Pru went through was remarkable.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Okay. So for those who didn't hear online, so we would just our guest was commenting that she grew up in the same areas, but also was a caregiver for her husband, and the descriptions were quite on point. And I'm reminding him, last summer I had to take away the keys from my father because he's gone down so much. So that there's a point in the book where I think Spence is told he can't teach anymore.
Right.
And, that really, connected with me because I think, for all Alzheimer's patients or people that's suffering with dementia, there's that, and maybe you saw this with your father yourself, that there's this point where you have to start taking things away from them, even if they feel they're not ready.
Yeah, it's a very sad time. I mean, I live in New York City, and my dad lived in New York City, so no one drives there. So there are no keys to be taken away. But, the metaphorical keys of, taking away his ability to teach. It's very hard, and you do want to respect the person's autonomy for as long as possible. But, yeah, there did come a time for Spence and also for my father when it really wasn't realistic for him to be teaching any longer. It wasn't fair to the students. It wasn't fair to the school. And you have to balance, various people's needs. So.
That is true. That's definitely very, very true. Can you tell us a little bit? Oh, sorry, Tamara, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought that, by the way, my husband did not have Alzheimer's, but just being a caregiver
Right.
itself, and her being such a young woman, it was really heartbreaking.
Right.
But I just wanted to say that I think the end of the book is just perfect. It just is that everybody I'm not telling you anything, but everybody has an opportunity.
Thank you.
For denouement, good.
Thank you.
So for everybody who is watching, that was another positive comment about the book. If you haven't read it, that the ending is truly wonderful as well. And I think one of the things about this novel is that it's a complete story, and of course you can say all novels are complete stories. They're meant to be, but so, I don't know how to, if I'm expressing it correctly, but there are some that truly you feel a wholeness to them in terms of the story that they tell and how they begin, and also the resolution there. And thank you for that.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate that.
I'm wondering if you have a moment, just reflect. This is your fourth?
Fourth book, yeah.
This is your fourth. So what has the reaction been to this?
I mean, I've been very fortunate. I mean, the reviews have been really outstanding, and the sales have been good. So, you always hope for the best, but there's always a lot of luck involved. I've been very fortunate in general. But, I like coming down to Florida, especially in the winter, and talking about the book. And, I like helping the book out in whatever ways I can. But I'm really happiest, when I'm actually writing, because there I feel like I have real control. I'm not saying that, it's not inevitable that you're going to get it right, but if you spend 8 years and you try hard enough, you'll usually you hopefully get as close to right as you can get it to be. Whereas when the book comes out, there's so many things out of your control. Do the reviewers like it? How are the sales? As I said, the response has been incredibly positive, and I've been very fortunate. But, that's always a stressful time for a writer, and the less stressful time, or a different kind of stress, is, sitting in front of your computer and trying to get it right.
First of all, my son actually had your father.
Oh, great. At Columbia Law School.
Yes. And I know a bit about the Henkin family because I worked with, I think it's your Aunt Henkin.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So,
In New Haven? Where?
well, she's
Wait, she was in Israel, so you work with her through Nishma. So yes, so I was confusing. So Chana Henkin is my cousin, actually. My aunt was also named Anne Chana, so, so.
What I'm wondering is, knowing, your family is a very, very well-known and respected family in the Orthodox world, for sure. The rebellion that Arlo shows, is that a little bit, does your background play into that rebellion just a little bit too?
Well, I mean,
Let me just repeat the question in case people didn't hear. So
Yeah.
the question was if Joshua Henkin's family is kind of well known in the Orthodox Jewish world, was the rebellion that Arlo displayed as a youth connected to yours.
Right. I mean, not in any. I guess what I'd say is not in any obvious way. Well, I guess in other words, Arlo himself, although Linda, his mother, is Jew. I mean, Arlo's really raised without Judaism, so there's nothing for him to rebel against. And in terms of that, and his particular rebellion really doesn't surround religion at all. I think all of our characters are a combination of imagination and what we know of people out there and fantasy and things like that. But I guess I would say, to the extent that Arlo resembles me, it really has nothing to do with religion, but it's much more. I'm very much like Sarah. I was a good student. I was obedient. So to the extent that there's any sort of fantasy there, it's more about not playing by the rules in terms of academics, but that has nothing to do with religion. So yeah.
I have a Zoom question.
Sure.
Bonnie, she asked part of what you just answered. She asked which character you identified with most, and how did the book change you, if it did?
So I don't really. I said I most resemble Sarah in certain superficial ways, but I don't really identify with. I don't think about the question of identifying with characters, because I feel like I need to inhabit all my characters, no matter who they are, and so that's my job. And so I'm not interested in sort of liking one character more or liking one character less. There's certain, in all my books, there's certain characters where if you said to me, well, you had to be their parent or you had to be their friend, would you choose A over B? Sure. But I actually find that one of the pleasures of reading fiction and one of the pleasures of writing fiction is that you get to enjoy the company of people whose company you might not enjoy in real life. And so, you can close the book. So I'm kind of like, I don't feel like I'm in the business of identifying with characters one way or the other. I'm in the business of sort of channeling them. But so, what did the book teach me? Is that what you would?
How did the book, if it did, change you, writing the book?
Well, yeah, that's hard to say. I'm getting older, although I still like to think of myself as a relatively young person. But when you're, I started writing the book I'm almost 58. So I started writing the book when I was in my late 40s. So, that's, you can do the math, but that was a sixth of my life, 8 years at that point, if I started at 48. If you write a book that takes, my second book, Matrimony, took me 10 years, and I started that when I was 34, so it went to 34 to 44. That was, a third of my life. So, you inevitably are going to change in the course of writing the book, just because we all change over the course of 8 years. But how the process of writing the book made me change, that's a lot harder for me to say. It was one of the things that I was doing over the course of those 8 years. But I was also raising 2 daughters and being a husband and dealing with one dog, and then that dog died, and I have another dog. I have my students. So, I guess I'd venture to say that probably raising my daughters changed me more than writing the book. But if you ask me how my raising my daughters changed me, I couldn't say. I just know that these are all powerful experiences, so they must have some kind of impact on you.
How old are they now? Your daughters?
So my older daughter is 18, and she's on a gap year in a Jewish program actually in the Northwest in Portland called Tivnu, it's kind of a Jewish Habitat for Humanity. They live, a bunch of 18-year-olds live in a couple of houses together, and they build houses for the homeless, and they do internships. So they work on social justice, and then she's coming back east next year to go to Haverford College outside of Philadelphia. And my younger daughter, so that's Orly, my older daughter. My younger daughter Tamar is a sophomore in high school in New York.
So, one last question for me, and I'm just curious because we were talking a few minutes ago about rebellion, and you said you more identified with Sarah, who was the obedient child. But at some point, did you do something to rebel, like that helped formulate how you are as a writer? Like go to college out of state or something like that? Or like go to college out of state?
I did go to college out of state. But,
well, for some that is a form of rebellion.
Well, I went to Harvard for college, and
well, that is out of state.
My father went to Harvard Law School. It's a real stretch to call that a rebellion. It's funny if you ask my father when he was alive, he might have said that I'd rebelled in certain ways, but he had a pretty narrow sense of what. He might have even said that I rebelled by writing fiction. He wanted me to get a PhD in the humanities. I was really heading on that route to getting a PhD in the humanities. I studied political theory in college. And then when I moved out to Berkeley after I graduated, and I was working for a magazine, and people might know that I worked for a magazine called Tikkun, and one of the things I was doing at Tikkun was I was the first reader of fiction manuscripts. I'd always wanted to be a fiction writer, but I also kind of wanted to play in the NBA, and at some point you realize you're neither good enough nor tall enough, and that's kind of how I felt about fiction writing, that I was, figuratively speaking, neither good enough nor tall enough. So, but then I was working at Tikkun, and I was the first reader of fiction manuscripts, and I saw how many horrible ones there were, and I didn't necessarily think I could do any better, but I thought if other people were willing to try and risk failure, I should be willing to try and risk failure too. And so, I started to write some fiction and took some courses and went to graduate school in fiction writing. So, if you have a very, very narrow sense of rebellion, then you could argue that I rebelled, but I think most parents, most parents wouldn't be.
My son rebelled. He went to Harvard. Yeah, so.
Yeah, so anyhow, yeah.
But thank you. I do remember Tikkun magazine. That was a great magazine. We have one last question here.
You mentioned you've written 4 books. I was wondering if it's the same editor now, and how you found your editor. And my second question relates to something that you said, was do you find that now that your style or your quality of writing is different than it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I've had the same editor so I was at Putnam for my first book, and then my editor there died, and then I moved to Pantheon, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, for the last 3 books. I've had this same publisher and the same editor for the last 3 books, and I've been very happy with her and with my publishing house. My agent. I mean, it's I leave the business to my agent. So that's in terms of I mean, I would imagine my style has changed some over the years, just because, at the very least, my interest has changed. You know, when I started to write, I was in my 20s, and now I'm in my 50s. So, you know, I'm an older person now, and I'm at a different stage of my life. But I think that if you read all 4 of my books, you would feel like that they're written by the same person. You know, it's interesting. There are certain writers who kind of are writing some version of the same. There's some great writers who are writing some version of the same book over and over again. And I would put like Philip Roth in that category. And then there's some great writers who write very different books each time. Someone like Jennifer Egan writes really quite different books each time. You know, I mean, the particulars of how I write are different from both Philip Roth and Jennifer Egan. But in that sense, I'm probably more in the Roth camp, in the sense that I think that my books are exploring similar preoccupations. They tend to be similarly compressed. I tend to work best with compression. I feel like less is more in general. I tend toward understatement. I tend toward a certain quiet kind of fiction that's interested in the small things in daily life. James Salter, the writer, said, "Life is weather, life is meals." And I think that that's how I feel, is that life is weather, life is meals, and then my job is to choose the right weather and the right meals so as to imply something more. That's a different version of Hemingway's Tip of the Iceberg, is that, you know, a lot of life is about the small moments, and I'm trying to make in my fiction, in this book, but really in all my books, trying to make the small moments resonant, to make the small moments feel big. So in that sense, there's a kind of unity across all of my work.
Well, thank you so much. That was a beautiful answer, a wonderful answer. And I think on that note, Joshua Henkin, I want to thank you. The book is Morningside Heights. I know that some of you have read it and some of you haven't. You have an opportunity to purchase it here. He'll autograph it for you.
And I would just add that I talk to a lot of book groups. So if people are in book groups and want me to talk to them, you can reach me through my website, and we can get something up on Zoom.
Wonderful. And for those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can go to the Ticket Leap reservation and purchase the book as well. And we would appreciate that, or support Books and Books, our local independent bookstore chain also. Joshua, thank you so much. This really has been great. I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you for coming out, everyone. Appreciate it.
And teaching us some of your wisdom. And the book is Morningside Heights. Thank you to everyone who came today, and the Jewish Book Council for helping bring you here to our community.
Great.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.
Oh, yes, sorry. Let's do a last little plug. For those of you who love books, sorry, I'm old. I'm not old like you. I'm not as limber as before. But Tuesday at 12:30, we're going to have our book club at Last Green Valley with Mark Sullivan. If you're interested, please go and sign up. You can reach out to us, and we'll make sure that you get on the book club. Okay? Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone.